Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled Enabling Access to Further Studies for Refugees, Presenting Results of Testing at Higher Education Institutions. This webinar is being provided as part of the NERIC project, Refugees and Recognition Toolkit 2, also known as the REACT project. My name is Jessica Stannert. I work as policy advisor at NUFIC, the Dutch Organization for Internationalization in Education, and the NERIC for the Netherlands. Before we get started, I would like to mention who the partners in the REACT project are and provide a few more details on how the webinar will be run. The project team consists of the NERICs of Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Ireland. The project steering group consists of colleagues from the European University Association, European Students' Union, Chiron, the Canadian Information Centre for International Credentials, and the ENIC Bureau President. The project is being coordinated by NOKUT, the Norwegian NERIC. The higher education institutions taking part in the project are the Oslo Metropolitan University, the University of Limerick, the University of Utrecht, the University of Bremen, LUISS in Italy, University Louis University, and the University of Limerick in Ireland. And just as a last thing, for some details about the webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last approximately 2 hours until 2 p.m. It is being recorded so that people who are unable to attend can listen to the webinar later on. The link to the recording will be published on the project website. My colleague Erlend Bern-Aser from the Norwegian NERIC will start the webinar by providing some background information on the REACT project. After we have heard the presentations and comments from our speakers, we will open up the floor for questions and answers. Please submit your questions through the chat box and they will be answered by the appropriate speaker. Finally, after all of the questions have been answered, we would appreciate it if you could fill in a very short survey regarding the webinar. I should say for a few of the presentations, we will have to make some adjustments regarding the speakers. And this is just to let you know that if there's a brief pause, this is normal. Okay, that's it for me. Erlend, you can now provide some more information on the REACT project. The floor is yours.
And welcome again to this webinar to all of you. As Jessica mentioned, this is a webinar held within the framework of the REACT project, where NOKUT is the project coordinator. Before we start hearing from the higher education institutions, I will provide you with some information about REACT, the testing that has taken place at the higher education institutions, and the format and agenda of today's webinar. So, the overall goal of the REACT project is to enhance the mobility, employability, and access to further studies for refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation in the European higher education area, including those without official documentation of their educational background. Moreover, the project aims to contribute towards the development of increasingly standardized processes for the recognition of refugees' qualifications at NERICs and higher education institutions. The project builds on the completed Refugees and Recognition Toolkit project, where a toolkit for recognition of refugees' qualifications was jointly developed by 8 ENIC NERICs. To gain a better understanding of how this methodology can be best implemented at local institutions, the main objective of the REACT project has been to test this methodology in cooperation with higher education institutions from Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Ireland. So, some about the testing that has taken place at the higher education institutions. So, from January to July this year, the higher education institutions involved in the project tested the toolkit at their institutions as a supplement to existing admission procedures. The objective was then to gain knowledge of how the toolkit could be of help for the universities in their assessments of applications from refugees for admission to further studies. As such, as part of this project, as part of this process taking place at the universities during this time period, the aim was to identify possible pathways for admission of refugee students to further studies. This webinar, in the format of a roundtable discussion with representatives from the higher education institutions, will present the main outcomes of the testing. We will touch upon several topics as part of our discussion today. all part of the process of assessing the qualifications held by refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation. So the different topics that we will be addressing today and discussing today, along with the representatives from the different higher education institutions, are what is the target group that we are talking about today? What are the different challenges faced with these applications and qualifications? What kind of tools have been tested by the universities and why? We will then talk about the specific results of the testing, both in terms of identifying possible pathways for admission, but also for the institutions as a whole. And then we will then wrap up by talking about how we are to build sustainable procedures for these assessments. And then at the end of the webinar, as Jessica mentioned, we will then have a Q&A session. So at the end of the webinar, feel free then, we will then of course bring it up then at the end of the webinar again. Feel free then to ask your questions in the chat box, and we will then address them at the end of the webinar as well. So to get started, we will start about talking about the target group. So we have to discuss then at the start how we conceptualize the target group when we speak about refugees, recognition, and admission. A natural place to start when we are speaking about the target group is the Lisbon Recognition Convention. More specifically, Article 7 of the Convention, which provides a comprehensive definition of the target group. Signatory countries of the LRC are committed to the principles outlined in Article 7, where it is described that all parties to the Convention shall take feasible and reasonable steps to develop procedures designed to assess whether refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation fulfill the relevant requirements for access to higher education, even in cases in which the qualifications cannot be proven through documentary evidence. So, as such, the principles in Article 7 represents a commitment for both NARICs and higher education institutions from the signatory countries. And this means that when we speak about refugees' qualifications in this setting, it also includes displaced persons and persons in a refugee-like situation. So, but how is then the target group understood and operationalized in practice at higher education institutions when assessing applications for admission to further studies? So, in regards to that, we will first hear from our representative from Oslo Metropolitan University, Liv Silje Borg, who is here with me today. So, Liv Silje, how does your institution understand the description of the target group in Article 7? And how did your institution conceptualize the target group in advance of the testing?
Thank you, Erlend. Just like you said, the Lisbon Recognition Convention refers to refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation. Like you see on the slide, we have highlighted the phrase refugee-like, since we believe it's not really a question of their legal status, but a person's de facto situation. And when we conceptualized for this project, we decided that we needed to find the candidates during the admission process. So we started by identifying possible programs where these persons would more likely be among the applicants. And at our university, that meant looking at the master's degree programs and the complementary educational programs for refugees. And the way we saw it, the potential candidate would be an applicant with partly missing documents and or non-verifiable documents. And it turned out that that meant applications from Iraq and Afghanistan in this case. And it was also important for us to only choose applicants where testing the tool would most likely provide some value added in the credential evaluation process, since we are careful, we try not to burden the applicants with more bureaucracy than necessary.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Liv Silje. Very interesting. And we will also be hearing from Megan van der Molsel from Utrecht University about how these questions were viewed and addressed in Utrecht. So Megan, the floor is yours.
So rather unlike our colleagues in Oslo, we actually conceptualized the target group in a little bit more practical manner. This means, in this case, We try to find candidates who have a residence permit for asylum in the Netherlands, who are missing all or part of the documentation to verify their educational background, which is normally speaking a requirement for admission to our university. The reason we chose to focus on people in possession of a residence permit for asylum is because in order to be allowed to study in the Netherlands, you are required to have a legal status, and the legal status is represented with a document, a residence permit card, so we can actually verify that someone meets this criteria. And in addition, the type of residence permit that is issued in the Netherlands to people in a refugee-like situation is asylum. So that was the most logical connection for us to make in this case. So that's why we chose to operationalize the target group in this manner.
So great. Thank you very much for that, Megan. And thank you, Liv Silly, as well before. It's very interesting to hear about how different universities relate to these questions and how the target group can be operationalized in practice at different institutions. Yes, and now we will transition to our next topic, also part of the process of assessing refugees' qualifications, which is the different challenges faced with these assessments. So, educational institutions face several challenges in their assessments. First, when we have a look at the sheer numbers, more than 68.5 million people are displaced worldwide, according to the UNHCR. And less than 3% of refugees have access to higher education. So that is kind of in terms of when we're speaking about the volume here. As for the recurrent challenges that we often see, these are undocumented or partially documented qualifications, unfinished qualifications, destroyed archives and not operative institutions, and questions concerning the notoriety of documents. So then we can then talk about inadequately documented qualifications here as a category, which includes numerous challenges that can make it difficult for institutions to assess refugees' qualifications through ordinary recognition and admission procedures. The specific challenges that higher education institutions face in their assessments will of course vary depending on several things. There can also be other institutional challenges related to cooperation between different departments and reaching out to the target group. So it is therefore interesting then to hear more from some of the higher education institutions about the challenges they face when working with assessing these applications for admission. So we will first hear now in this section from our representative from Academy here ahead Bremen, representing several universities in Bremen, one of them being the University of Bremen, Jens Kemper. Jens, what kind of applications did you identify to take part in the testing at your institution? And what kind of challenges did you face with assessing these applications?
Yes, thank you, Ellen. Hello, everyone from Bremen. Yes, we have many programs for refugees. So we have had in the last years a few hundreds of applications. And so the first thing was already discussed is that there must be a refugee-like situation, which can be very interesting. Sometimes we had an interesting case with a Spanish passport holder, but coming from Syria. But in each bureaucratic step, there was a problem. Anyhow, by far the most applicants for our programs had to apply via a central evaluation service first. It's called UniAssist in Berlin. And they examine if higher education access is possible. They also do it if an applicant has no documentation about this. One important thing we learned through this, so there were hundreds of applications and we didn't look close. We just got information, missing documents, and categorized them in this Toolkit program. But we learned then that some documents are not really needed for higher education access. So like a university entrance exam is missing, but we have the full degree program and documented. So this was a bit work to do, let's say. And applicants must come from Bremen region or they have to apply for one of our universities. The challenges were one, at the initial step that internal discussions were very delicate because there were concern that this way could be misused. And on the other hand, we felt a duty, we must publish it, we must bring the information to the people. And I think in the process of maybe a few months, we had all on board to say, yes, we go public with this. Actually, administratively, then the largest challenge was to clear who is doing what and when. To build up a running system, which is UniAssist with us, and then the KMK as the most important partner in this procedure came into. And especially in the first part, it was difficult. We built the information triangle with UniAssist in Berlin, with us and the applicant. And this was very hard to make it transparent for the applicants. So this was actually a lot of work, and yeah, that's what I wanted to say to this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jens. Very interesting. So we will also be hearing from Megan in Utrecht in regards to the applications that were identified to take part in the testing there, and what kind of challenges that were faced there in making these assessments. So Megan, the floor is yours.
So in Utrecht, we mainly identified candidates via our regular admissions procedure. Everybody is basically able to apply for a program at our university. They have to upload certain documentation, and based on that documentation, we verify if somebody meets the admission requirements for the specific study program that they apply for. In our experience up till now, most people who apply via this regular process, even the refugees, did have the necessary documentation. But of course, in this pilot, we were actively looking for people who did meet the requirements for admission, but did not have the documentation to prove their educational background. And we found these via the regular admissions procedure, people applying but not being in possession of mainly two documents that we normally require in order to admit someone to a program, which is a diploma and a transcript. So some of the people we found via the regular admissions procedure were missing either one or both of these documents. So we could use the toolkit in order to verify their educational background in a different manner. And one of the main challenges in this department was time, actually. The interaction and communication between the React project officer, which was me, and the candidates often took up quite a lot of time, from providing tailored instructions to answering their questions and then evaluating their responses and the documentations they provided. And at the same time, internally, we had no existing infrastructure for checking the qualifications in a different manner. If someone was not in possession of the right documentation, they would not be admitted. So we had to find another internal procedure and make sure that we had the cooperation of the admissions office to evaluate the credentials and also the deans from the study programs to help us with, for instance, an interview with the candidate as part of the pilot. So those were the main challenges. And I think the toolkit was very useful in that sense because it provided an alternative method to check if somebody has the educational background that they say they have, even if they don't have the documentation to prove this.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Megan. And also Jens, previously. As we heard, there are different challenges that institutions face in these assessments, both in terms of assessing the available documentation and other aspects that are part of the process as a whole on an institutional level as well. So we will now transition to our next topic, which is tools, as we have now talked about how the target group can be conceptualized. and the different challenges institutions face in these assessments, it is natural to talk more about how we can address these challenges through making use of practical tools as supplements to ordinary admission procedures. So, as mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, the universities have tested a toolkit for recognition of refugees' qualifications as part of this project. And the toolkit was developed in cooperation between NICNARICS and the first Cycle Refugees from Recognition project. And it is intended as a first aid kit for staff looking to evaluate inadequately documented qualifications. In terms of the content of the toolkit, we will not go into detail, but on an overarching level, the toolkit consists of 3 parts. First, we have 8 principles that provide a basis for building procedures for the assessment of refugees' qualifications, focusing on the importance of building fair, professional, and transparent procedures. Secondly, 10 tools are described in the toolkit, which were identified, developed, and tested by NICNARICS in the previous project. The tools described are for both document-based and interview-based assessments. Lastly, 2 different ways of applying the tools into systematic procedures are described in the toolkit. And these are the qualifications passport for refugees and background report. So the tools described in the toolkit can be tested separately or as part of the procedures described. This is also how it has been approached by the universities as part of the testing period. And it is, of course, interesting for us to hear about how the toolkit could be of help for universities as supplements to their ordinary admission procedures. So we will now again hear from Megan in Utrecht. So Megan, which of the tools did you test at your university, and why did you decide to test these particular tools?
So actually we incorporated almost all of the tools from the toolkit in one way or another. Because testing time was relatively short, we tried to incorporate the tools into the existing infrastructure of the regular admissions procedure as much as possible. Some of the tools were very useful in supplementing already existing credential evaluations, such as the country briefings, the databases collection, the self-evaluation questionnaire, some aspects of that, as well as the level placement. We worked together with NUFIC and asked students to apply for an indication of their education level with NUFIC, which they then provided to us for verification. So we used all of those to supplement the way we already evaluated credentials from foreign schools at our admissions office. And we added an additional step to make sure that we could also evaluate the credentials of the people who did not have all of the required documents. So once again, that's the diploma and the transcript of their previous education. And for that, we used the self-evaluation questionnaire and interviewing. We did this together with the deans or the study advisors of the study program that the candidate in question was applying for. These 2 tools were of most additional value because in combination, they worked well to evaluate educational background and because there was, as I mentioned, no procedure available yet at our university for people who did not have any or all the required documentation. It provided us with an alternative method to evaluate that they did indeed meet the requirements for admission as far as educational background is concerned, where up till this point, we basically just had to not admit these people to begin with. So it was a great way to test if there's an alternative possible and if exceptions can be made.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Megan. Very interesting. So we will also hear from one more representative in regards to the tools that were tested. We will hear from our colleague Jens in Bremen again, in terms of which tools the university decided to test and why these particular tools were seen as interesting supplements in Bremen. So the floor is yours, Jens.
Yes, thank you, Alan, again. what we did also was that we nearly used all of the options given by the toolkit. And the first thing is the foreign education database run by KMK. Of course, this is the basic information about the quality to expect, and also it has a legal influence on our admission procedures. The second one is actually not part of the toolkit. It's a test for academic studies. But all the applicants who want to join a study preparation program in Bremen have to pass this test. It's a quite long test, about 5 hours, about cognitive processing. And so we have this additional to all the other tools. One important thing was the questionnaire. Yeah, this was very interesting, where they provide us with their their educational biography, and we had to discuss this quite long with the candidates to clarify what we want. Was an interesting experience, actually. I must mention, of course, that the core partner was the KMK for us. So we worked very close together in this procedure. And you can see that this verification and checklist and at the end, the report is done by KMK. And the interview done, of course, for us at that time, the most important thing was done together then with them here in Bremen. And we made a little overview on which situation. I won't explain this all, of course, right now. So which document is missing and which tool set we want to apply for that. One thing was that we learned the interview is very delicate as well. So we changed some things, but we tried to prepare us for everything. And maybe I can give a little more information later on our outcomes and why we changed some things. Thank you.
Jens, and also to Megan for sharing your experiences with testing the different tools at your institutions. And it's very interesting to hear about how you approach the testing and the added value of the different tools and procedures that you have tested as part of this during this time period as part of this process. So yes, we have now covered the process from identifying a target group, how that can be done at different institutions, the challenges faced with assessing inadequately documented qualifications at different institutions in different countries, and the testing of specific tools and approaches as supplements to ordinary admission procedures. And we have heard then from the representatives from the different universities about how they approach this process and their experiences with doing so. So it's therefore natural now, I believe, to hear more about the results of this comprehensive testing process, both in terms of identifying possible pathways for admission of refugee students to further studies, and on a broader institutional level as well. So we will, in this section of the webinar, hear more from all of the higher education institutions that are taking part in the project, the 5 higher education institutions. And we can start this section with Liv Silje, again, from Oslo Metropolitan University. So Liv Silje, what were the results of the testing at your university? What impact did it have for the candidates involved? And in what way has the toolkit been integrated into the current admission procedures of the university?
Well, yeah, just firstly, I would just say that at our university, we tested the questionnaire, the self-evaluation template, and it contained information about the applicant's educational and professional background, including information about the length of the educational programs, reasons for any delays, content of any thesis, details about work experience, etc. So it was quite comprehensive. And it turned out to be a useful supporting document for us. And it turned out that we tested it on 3 candidates, and one of the candidates was offered admission, while the other 2 were not deemed qualified since they did not fulfill the language requirements. However, their educational documents were considered admissible for admission. So, like I said, it turned out to be a useful supporting document. And the way we see it, the toolkit is just what it's called. It's a toolkit. So where we can use different tools in different cases. And some of the tools have already been used by Oslomet for a long time. An example, the country information or the verification procedures, and others are not relevant, like the interviews or report templates. But the questionnaire was definitely interesting to test, and it turned out to be a good supporting document.
Thank you very much for that, Liv Silje. It's very interesting to hear how that's the results of the testing at Oslo Metropolitan University. So we will then move on to our next presenter in regards to the results and in Bremen. We will hear from Jens about the results in Bremen and also in what way the toolkit has been integrated into current admission procedures of those universities. So the floor is yours, Jens.
Yes, the toolkit is implemented into admissions at our universities as it became part of our legal situation, actually, not the toolkit itself, but the testing ways are open, how we can make sure that missing documents can be proven by the biography. So it's part of our work right now. The interesting thing is one view, we started with 24 possible candidates. At the end, we tested 3. So there are dropouts from our program. There's no interest in studying anymore. A lot of others, they in between got documents. And so that at the end, a few are still pending. And at the end, there were 3 left. And you can see here the results. The main thing is right now that no one passed the expert interview. And all 3 candidates have only study experience of 2 years, 1.5 years. And we found out that the expert interview and the testing setting are totally overwhelming for the candidates. Yeah, this the candidate A, it was quite clear there was something, okay, this is not matching for higher education access. Candidate C was quite okay, yeah, but still the expert had to find out if there was 1 year of successful studies. And so that's why we changed this situation now, that we give such people the option who have short studies, but they need the short studies to study in Germany, give the option via an entrance exam instead of an expert interview. So all candidates received indirect higher education access, so they can go through this entrance exam. This is what they received from Bremen universities, as the federal system in Germany is there a bit complicated. Yeah, so they got a letter from the University of Bremen. But the E is missing. EQPR was done then by the KMK. The interview was held in Bremen, so the KMK came to Bremen, and the expert, it was all done in one setting. First the general interview, then the expert interview, and then the reporting to the examination office after this.
Very much for that, Jens. Information about the results of the testing in compiled results of the testing in Bremen. So we will now move on to our next presenter, and that's talking about the results of the testing in Utrecht, and that is Megan. So Megan, the floor is yours.
So at Utrecht University, we had not a huge number of respondents who contacted us, who were actually the target group that we were looking for. So they approached us either via a special email address that we started up, that we informed the different faculties of, that if they ran into refugees or people who met the criteria of the pilot program, that they could refer to us. Or, as I mentioned before, via the regular international admissions procedure. There were 9 people actually contacted us one of these 2 ways. The first thing we had to do was check if somebody in theory met the requirements for admission to the program of their choice. Not all of these 9 people actually were admissible to begin with, regardless of whether they had the right documentation or not. So 3 of those respondents we did not continue with. Of the eligible candidates, we sent out the self-evaluation questionnaire that they had to fill out, and they had to approach the NAFEC for the certificate of their educational level. Out of the 6 eligible candidates, 3 people never actually got back to us. They either decided not to apply after all, they didn't have time, or they couldn't do it within the testing period. So out of the 3 people we got back, we tried to schedule in the interviews, which would have been the final step into evaluating their credentials. Here at this stage, once again, one person fell through, but the other 2 people we had an interview with, along with the study advisors of the 2 different study programs that each of these candidates was interested in, and both of these interviews went well enough that they received a conditional admission to the study program of their choice. So for those candidates who normally would have been refused admission based on the fact that they did not have the required documentation for admission, they now, because of this testing, actually did receive a conditional admission. Unfortunately, they failed to meet other requirements. In one case, this was the English language requirement, and in the other case, it was a couple of courses that they had to pass in order to be fully admissible for the study program that they applied for. So unfortunately, neither of them actually got to start for a study program this year, but we're hoping that they can meet these requirements and maybe start a year later. So that was the results for the candidates themselves, and for us as a university, the most important result was that we now have the chance to test an alternative approach to verifying educational background. As I mentioned, we're currently evaluating not only within the admissions office, but also in cooperation with the different study programs, how we can use this new information and the toolkit and incorporate that into our international admissions procedure in the future. So we're working on that.
Much for that, Megan, presenting the compiled results of the testing at Utrecht University. So our next presenter who will be talking about the results at that university is Michele Gradoli, representing Luis Guido Carli University in Rome, Italy. So Michele, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm here with my colleague Maria Giovanna Repaci, who is responsible, who works in the international admission within the student office, and she will present the impact of the React toolkit within our university.
Yeah. So concerning the testing of the toolkit at LUIS, our admission procedure for international students is a qualification-based selection. So students need to present some documents, and within the documents, the transcript of records for their last year of academic studies is extremely important for selection. So in case of missing documentation, of course, the application of the toolkit was always taken into account, but fortunately all interested candidates for this academic year, so 2019-2020 selection, had all the necessary documents, so all the required documentation for the evaluation of their application. So we did not need to apply the toolkit in these cases. However, for this academic year, we had a refugee student who is now enrolled in our master's degree in corporate finance, and he as well had all its documents ready for application. So we did not, there was no need to apply the toolkit in this case. But of course, the admission office was trained on the use of the toolkit, and we were ready to use it in case it was needed.
Yes, I want to underline that the React toolkit is integrated in our procedures, in our admission procedures. So the student office team is informed and trained in order to apply the React toolkit whenever it could be helpful for their admission of refugee students. Moreover, all the candidates are aware that the Lewis Students Office supports them giving information, and of course the React toolkit and the React project is part of our expertise now, so the student office is more and more prepared to answer their questions, their requests, even when they come from different or critical backgrounds.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Michelle. It's very interesting to hear how this has been approached and the results of the testing and being part of this project at the different institutions. So I believe that we will now try to hear from our last representative for this topic on results. We will hear from John Lannon, representing the University of Limerick in Ireland. So, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I apologize that I don't have video, but I hope that you can all hear me. First, I should say that in 2017, we introduced what we call a University of Sanctuary program at our university, and it provides scholarships to refugees, asylum seekers, and others in a refugee-like situation. And this increased the need for mechanisms to assess their qualifications. So we opted to use the toolkit to ensure accessibility and effectiveness and transparency in relation to postgraduate program entry. And we tested the toolkit with 3 students. The criteria we used for the choice of candidates was that they were already enrolled on our Mature Student Access Certificate program at the university. This is a 1-year program for adult learners, in other words, people that are over 23. Many of the students that complete this Access Certificate program will seek entry to undergraduate or postgraduate courses. Now, the entry to the undergraduate programs is overseen by the National Central Applications Office, but entry to the postgraduate programs is via the university's international office. So in testing the toolkit, we work with them, with the international office and with a number of course directors. And the tools that we used were primarily the databases with information on education systems and status of educational institutions. And we also used the questionnaire, the self-evaluation template. The first of these was used to test if automatic entry to the postgraduate program was possible for the candidates. And this wasn't the case with any of the 3 students, so the questionnaire was used. And the outcome then was that 2 of those students gained entry to postgraduate diploma programs. The other didn't and will revert to an undergraduate program. In all cases, the programs were appropriate for their specific students, and they will, we hope, lead to increased employment opportunities for, particularly for the 2 postgraduate students in 1 year's time, less than 1 year now. The University of Sanctuary program that I mentioned is, of course, one of our primary stakeholders in this entire process. And it's seeking to capture learnings from the uses of the tools. Our international office also benefited from the experience. because the processing of applicants who are asylum seekers or otherwise in a refugee-like situation is quite a new experience for them. So there was quite a lot of valuable learning for us across the board, but particularly in our international office and in our University of Sanctuary program.
Thank you for that information about the results of the testing in Limerick, John. Very interesting. So as we have just heard, tangible impacts have been achieved as part of this process, both in terms of identifying possible pathways for admission of refugee students to further studies, and also towards building procedures adapted to the needs identified at the different universities. So for our final topic, as part of this process of assessing the qualifications held by refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation, we will talk about building sustainable procedures. So we have just heard from the higher education institutions about the main outcomes of the testing process. We will now try to think in terms of how we are to maintain the results that have been achieved and focus on the importance of building sustainable procedures. So it is important that we move towards or work towards moving from ad hoc solutions to developing systematic procedures for the assessment of refugees' qualifications, both in regards to recognition and admission processes. Moving in this direction can contribute towards solving specific challenges for educational institutions working with these cases and provide individuals in a difficult situation with a real opportunity to gain access to further studies. So, as signatory countries of the Lisbon Recognition Convention, as mentioned previously, we as educational institutions have committed ourselves to developing fair, professional, and transparent procedures for the assessment of refugees' qualifications. And to wrap up our discussion today, we will hear the thoughts of the higher education institutions in regards to building sustainable procedures at the institutional level and the impact of the project on this work. So, I believe we can start with Jens in Bremen. So Jens, how has your participation in the project contributed towards addressing the challenges that you face with inadequately documented qualifications? And what kind of impact has the project had on your institution's approach to building sustainable procedures?
Yes, we had the chance to build up a system that should be running now for the next, I don't know how many years. So we have in Bremen, as a small state in Germany, we have a central responsibility for 3 universities. What meant we had to build a cooperation with the examination offices, who will issue then the admission, although the KMK is doing this EPQR. We had also a cooperative, to build a cooperative system of examining boards, to bring experts and professors from different universities together in one board. But this is all set up in between, and React and the Toolkit really provided a reliable structure. Let's say we could also, with this structure now, convince all the people who had the fear of the misuse of this option, convince them that this is somehow reliable and safe, so there will be no misuse and nobody will be able to sneak into a position there. So I think this was a hard work, actually, 3 universities, and but we did it, and now it's part of our processing of enrollment at 3 universities.
For your input, Jens, in regards to our talking about building procedures at the institutional level and the impact of the project on this work. So I believe that now we will try and transition to hear from Liv Silje again from Oslo Metropolitan University. So Liv Silje, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Well, the challenges with partly documented degrees and unverifiable documents has received increased attention at Oslo Metropolitan University for the last few years. So the participation in this project has made sure that we maintain commitment and awareness, and it has also provided us with an opportunity to test a new tool, successfully tested, I would say. In regards to sustainable procedures, we also believe that what is needed is a variety of tools and a variety of approaches, since each case is different. An institution needs commitment to assessing these cases fairly and must see each case separately. So we strive for a coherent practice, fair and equal treatment, but fair assessment does not necessarily mean an identical approach. So you might use different tools in different cases.
Great. Thank you very much for that input, Liv Silje, about how you are working at the Oslo Metropolitan University. So we will now then, as for our next presenter about building sustainable procedures, we will hear from Megan in Utrecht. So Megan, the floor is yours.
So at Utrecht University, as I mentioned before, there was no alternative policy in place for refugee applicants to one of our university programs, missing all or part of the documentation to prove their educational background. We always requested certified copies of diploma and transcripts as a requirement for admission. So our participation in the REACT project has allowed us to try out an alternative approach for this specific group within the admissions procedure. It's provided us with an alternative way to try and verify someone's qualification when the requirement documents are not available. So it's a way to test an alternative methodology. It's also helped raise awareness and dialogue internally at our university. Especially also our cooperation with the study advisors, the faculties of the specific programs where our candidates were interested in applying for. It has basically sparked an internal discussion on how we can approach similar cases in the future. Are we going to continue the way that we are currently approaching the admission, or can we implement an alternative approach in case of limited or unavailable documentation in cases of refugees? So we're currently evaluating how we can incorporate our experiences with inadequately documented qualifications into our admissions procedures, also in cooperation with the study programs where people are applying for. And it's also helped us with promoting internal cooperation and laying the groundwork for an alternative infrastructure, for an alternative procedure. So that's very useful going into the future, where, of course, we can expect a certain number of applicants every year that are in a similar situation. And as Erland mentioned, instead of approaching these cases ad hoc when they come across our desk, we can actually start building a policy towards how to approach cases like this, so that it is clear for everyone how we can go about that in the future.
Great. Thank you very much for that input, Megan, about working towards building these procedures in Utrecht, and also the impact of the project on with testing this alternative methodology, raising awareness, and creating an alternative system at the university. So yes, we have now heard from Megan in Utrecht, and we will ask for our next presenter to talk about the impact of the project on building sustainable procedures. We will hear again from John in Limerick. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you again, Erland. Actually, the timing of the Toolkit testing was good for us, because we were in the second year of the University of Sanctuary program that I mentioned already. And together, the Toolkit and the Sanctuary program helped us basically break new ground for the university. Toolkit itself is a useful guide for us as we work towards greater access for people in refugee-like situations to our programs. We probably won't use the full suite of tools, but things like the self-evaluation template, the other templates will provide a very useful basis for us for the development of our own forms and templates for evaluation and reporting. Actually, most of the experience during the testing was with the self-evaluation template, but our course directors believed it was useful. Now, it overlaps with other existing processes like our recognition or prior learning process, but the toolkit provides some useful additional elements like specializations, career aspirations for education, research projects, that sort of thing. And this is what I mean by the important process. We need to take, or will take, the useful elements of the React toolkit and embed them in our existing processes. And I should also note that this will form part of the review of our Sanctuary program. We've a 3-year action program or action plan that will end at the end of the 2019-20 academic year. So that will be a key point for us. In terms of how we go forward, we're also already working with local NGOs that provide support for asylum seekers and refugees, and we're discussing use of the toolkit with them. We also, within the university, need to extend the toolkit's use beyond postgraduate programs. And one other point that I would make is that there are other universities of Sanctuary in Ireland, and we'd like to see harmonisation of the process across all of those, across all of the higher education institutes in the country. At present, each institution works independently. There's a lot of progress to ensure access to third-level education for people in refugee-like situations in the country, but we do need greater coordination and harmonisation. That will be quite beneficial for us. And I think in fact, I'm quite confident the toolkit will help us in that regard. And of course, the development of common principles, good practices across all the NARIC countries would certainly help to guide that undertaking.
Great. Thank you very much for that information, John. It's very interesting to hear how everything has been approached in Limerick, and also your thoughts on the future in terms of building procedures and integrating the toolkit as part of how you approach these cases and these issues. So lastly, we will now hear from Michele in Rome at Luis in terms of the impact of the project on building sustainable procedures. So Michele, the floor is yours.
So the toolkit really helped us in the challenges that we faced when addressing inadequately documented qualifications, because, as I mentioned, our call for application includes transcripts of records, so documentation on the academic background of the candidate is extremely important. However, having the toolkit at hand allowed us to contact each and every candidate with incomplete documentation. So we contacted each candidate who hadn't uploaded their transcript of records, for example, and we asked why. So we invited him or her to explain the lack of documentation, and we offered assistance on how to proceed in case they were not able to retrieve it. But as I mentioned before, they were all able to provide us with the required documentation. Of course, this helped in the selection. And concerning inadequate documentation, another important instrument that we always use is our relation with CIMEA, because our relation with them always helps us in understanding if a candidate sends us strange documents that we see, so we don't really know how to evaluate it. We contact them, and they have always been helpful in assessing the academic background of the candidate.
Thank you. And I would like to add that the participation of our university in this project is considered very important because Louis, as a globally engaged university, imply efforts dedicated to the inclusion of refugees, and of course React Toolkit is another important instrument to guarantee the safety and the reliability of the selection through sustainable procedures.
Thank you very much for that, Michele, in Rome. And thank you all to all representatives from the higher education institutions for your very thoughtful input. I'm sure it is very interesting for other higher education institutions and other educational institutions as such to hear, working with similar cases of for recognition or admission purposes, to hear about your experiences with building procedures and how you have been moving forward with these procedures also as part of this project, as part of the testing period, also as part of the React project as a whole. So we have now gone through the topics that we would like to discuss as part of the process of assessing the qualifications held by refugees, displaced persons, and persons in a refugee-like situation, and related to the testing period that has been that is completed and has taken place at the different higher education institutions that have presented their experiences to you all, which you all shared their experiences with you all today. So as for our concluding remarks, we have now then covered several important parts of the process of assessing the qualifications of refugees and heard experiences of the higher education institutions. We have heard about the testing of different tools and procedures. The institutions have approached the testing differently based on their mandates, institutional structures, and challenges with these qualifications. As such, we hope to have created an arena for mutual learning between stakeholders working within the same field. We also hope that this webinar can provide an arena for mutual learning and exchange between stakeholders. And we rounded up then talking about the impact of the project. And the impact is related to both in terms of identifying possible pathways for admission of refugee students to further studies at the different institutions. And also in regards to how sustainable procedures can be implemented and adapted to the needs of a variety of institutions, working with a variety of mandates, structures, refugee populations, applicants, and processes, internal processes. So that was it for the roundtable discussion with the higher education institutions, presenting the main outcomes of the testing process in the React project. We hope it has been interesting to listen to, and that you can see the relevance of what has been achieved and the processes that has been presented and experiences that have been presented here today to your own work. So we will now have a short Q&A session. So if any of you have any questions, please write them in the chat box on your right-hand side, and we will do our best to answer them as we go. So yes, the first question that is asked here is, did you evaluate or discuss how to evaluate minimum grade requirements for these applicants? So if there are any of the representatives from the higher education institutions that would like to provide some thoughts on how they approach this at their institutions, feel free to take the word and provide your thoughts on whether you evaluated or discussed how to evaluate minimum grade requirements. I see Jens is online, so Jens can provide some thoughts here. Jens.
Yes, exactly. We discussed this as well, as we need some grades for admissions in especially the master programs we offer. And the internal discussion was like this: we cannot provide grades through the system because it does not connect to the other grading systems at all. Especially with an expert interview, you cannot grade somebody. And that's why we decided to try to make an extra admission window for people who run through the process. That's the situation in Bremen right now. We haven't had a case yet, but this is the planning.
Jens, are there any other that would like to contribute with some thoughts in regards to evaluating minimum grade requirements for applicants, or else we will move on to the next question. All right, great. I think we'll move on to the next question then. So I see that it's written in the chat box that from Elisabeth Bartman, I would be interested if other universities than Bremen also use an expert interview, i.e. a subject-specific interview by experts, for example, professors. And if so, what were the outcomes of the results? I do not believe that any other of the institutions made use of the expert interviews, but I know that as we have been presented, of course, in Utrecht, they performed an interview, a general interview with the applicants. So, and I think Megan presented some of their thoughts on how that worked and that it was successful. I'm not sure if Megan would like to present some more thoughts on how around performing interviews as part of these processes. If you have some thoughts about that, Megan, more than you already presented, feel free to bring them.
So in our case, the interviews that took place with representatives of the study program that the applicants were applying to. This meant in one case the Dean of Admissions and in another case a study advisor and the program coordinator of the other program. But the main reason behind the interview was checking whether the educational background, to verify the educational background, because the candidates did not have the necessary documentation to prove this, meaning the diploma and the transcript. So in this case, it didn't, the idea behind the interview was not to check whether someone had the necessary knowledge in order to be admitted to the program, because we could already evaluate that based on the education that they claimed they had. But of course, the representatives from the study program, because they were present at the interview, if any doubts were regarding whether the previous education was either completed so that their knowledge was complete. They were also there in order to dig more into the specific topics that were required for admission to the study program. But in these cases, it wasn't with professors or anything like that. No.
Great. Thank you very much, Megan, for elaborating on the use of interviews as part of your processes and procedures and within this time period. Let's see if I'm going to go into check the box here again, the chat box. So there's a question from Hessels who's writing, for candidates that were admitted, will you evaluate their progress during their studies? So yes. So if there are any of the representatives from higher education institutions that would like to elaborate on this, please feel free to do so.
Hello. We would like to share some information about the experiences that we are facing here in Italy. As far as it concerns the interview with an expert, Maria Giovanna would like to add something to this debate.
Our refugee student was selected for this ahead here was actually interviewed by the director of the course of studies. So we held a Skype interview with him because the professors wanted to get to know him better, and they wanted to understand if it was up to our standards. So they wanted to make sure that once here in Lewis, he would be able to cope with homework, with the workload, and so on. And they were really happy that they had the interview, because it was just the interview that brought to his admission. So, and then concerning
the other services.
Yes.
For example, in the questions we read the questions about language courses, tutoring activities, and supports for the student. As an international university, Lewis offers services of this kind, like tutors, university tutors, and academic tutors for all the students. And of course, when we welcome students coming from critical situations like disadvantaged places or refugees students, this service is of course reinforced, but it is existing for all the students. We have tutoring services, which is university tutors who follow the students during all their life in the university. They also have a teaching, a didactic support with academic tutors, and all the Lewis students are involved in language courses, and of course the international students, like refugee students as well, do attend Italian language courses.
I see that John is typing. He has written in the chat that he can provide some input on the last two questions. So John, feel free to provide your thoughts.
Hello, thank you. Yes, in relation to both the interviews and the ongoing evaluation, I would say that we found that the toolkit has worked best when it's incorporated into other existing processes. So, for example, with our postgraduate program entry, the course director is always going to make an assessment based on interview if necessary. And in the case of the three students that I spoke about that we tested the toolkit with, there were actually interviews or direct engagement with the students, as well as the use of the databases and the self-evaluation framework. In terms of ongoing evaluation, yes, we do, as a University of Sanctuary program, who have really been the ones who have rolled out the use of the piloting of the toolkit. We keep in close contact with the course directors as well, just to ensure that the things are going okay. So again, I think this is always going to be a collaborative, combined effort across our institution to ensure the success of people in refugee-like situations in our programs.
Great, thank you very much for that input, John, in regards to the questions that we have been presented with. I see that Marta is typing now, so we'll see if there's any follow-up questions here. I believe we have at least gone through most of the questions now that have been addressed, and representatives from the institutions have provided their thoughts on the different questions. Yes, we'll just wait and see what Marta is asking us. I'm sure quite shortly. So Marta is typing that, or is writing that, missing documentation and final high school grade. For example, to access regional scholarship here in Italy, it is necessary to have a certain grade. If the documentation is missing, is there any procedure to help us? So yes. So I think we can, if there are anyone of the representatives from the higher education institutions that would like to provide their thoughts on the situation, maybe in your countries, or how you think you can approach this challenge. So feel free to come in and provide your thoughts if there are any of you that have any comments to this question. Right, Jens, you're here. Come on, yes.
Yeah, I've been trying on this topic. So it's similar to what I said before. We came to the point that these cases are so rare with no documentation that it was not possible to implement that into the University Acts or other acts like this. So again, this decision made in Bremen is that we must find a way to make exemptions, and for that use other information from the process, and also using the toolkit, for instance, or from the test ICE results, and take some others. One must be able to step out of the normal way and say this is a exemption, and we make use of an exemptional regulation in this case. This is the point of discussion in Bremen.
Thank you very much for that, Jens. I see Marta is thanking you as well in the chat box. Yes, so let's see if we have any other questions. If so, if not so, I mean, we will round off the webinar for today, I believe. And I will, before you leave, we will be very glad if you could fill in a short survey that we are prepared for all of you before you leave the webinar room. So I believe Jessica will shortly present you with information about the survey. It's short and it's easy to make use of. And so Jessica, before we leave, feel free to provide the attendees with